50 years, that's not really that old.
It's post-Sherman-esque.
But over time, we really made a big impact.
1940s, after World War II, until 1974 when the Landmark Ordinance was passed, we lost as many houses as we lost or properties as when Sherman came to Columbia.
Historic Columbia has been very important in being kind of the focal point and the center of that sort of activity.
It's not only protecting and preserving, it's an awareness.
It gives us a view of ourselves that we wouldn't otherwise have.
Historic Columbia is important to the community because they preserve not only the historic houses that are here, which I think are very important to maintain the public ability to see historic properties, but I think the preservation program that they really are pushing is also important. You know, we tend to lose what's there if we don't think about it.
You have to have vision and you have to have action.
We expected the city to take action to protect those things that really defined Columbia.
We're standing in front of the Robert Mills House at 1616 Blanding Street. This 1823 structure is the reason Historic Columbia Foundation came to be in 1961.
I can remember when we were all so concerned about the Robert Mills House because it was in imminent danger of being destroyed because the owners were selling it. And we were determined to see if we couldn't save it, and had a good turnout of people who were concerned about the house.
My mother was Jenny Tabor Clarkson Dreer, and she was one of the leading forces in preserving the Robert Mills House, developing the Historic Columbia Foundation, which then was able to preserve the Hampton Preston House and many other of the important buildings in Columbia.
And I have never seen a group that worked together like that group did. We breathed in and out together.
Who noticed this block, this beautiful block that had a gorgeous house on it? It was so dilapidated that I think people had just stopped seeing it. And I remember very distinctly riding down Taylor Street with her, and she slowed down and she looked. She said, "Look at that house. I think that's a very important house, and they're about to tear it down." And it just stayed with me because that was the first mention for me, and it was the beginning of of the rest of our lives being involved with historic preservation.
Her energy began to be directed towards a lot of the beautiful properties in downtown Columbia that were in rack and ruin and were being lost to development on a daily basis. And she got together a group of like-minded Columbians, to begin with, mostly a group of women, of which my mother was one. And they began the conversation about preserving the history of Columbia.
Mrs. J.M.H. Fitzgerald, who was a very distinguished lady, and when we had one of our meetings and somebody said, "Oh, do you think we're going to be able to save the house?" And she said, "We must have faith. Faith is a bird that feels the dawn and sings while the light is still dark."
The handwriting was on the wall for the Mills House. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed and established the Historic Columbia Foundation for the express purpose of saving what is considered to be one of Columbia's greatest architectural jewels.
They made people aware of the gems we had here and the importance of that.
And they really became convinced that this needed to be done, that Columbia needed a property like this, that Columbia needed a preservation organization and historic houses that could interpret the history of the city. And they moved forward and pushed on it, and they wouldn't take no for an answer, because they had a founders program where if you gave $1,000, which in the early 60s was a lot more money than it is today, you were a founder. And that people finally reached a point where if they were going to a cocktail party, they knew they were going to be approached by Jenny or Jane or Sarah Harmon, one of these ladies, And they finally said, you know, it was easier to just go ahead and give them the $1,000 and I could go to the cocktail party without worrying about being hit up for some money.
It was a rather remarkable campaign, and especially when you consider that the poor man from the Midwest said, not a chance, it's at the bottom of everybody's list. I think we were determined to prove that man wrong.
They were very persistent, and I think we owe them a great debt of gratitude, or we would not have what has grown into, I think, a dynamic preservation and historic house operation in Columbia.
We were all very proud of the whole thing, and gradually the whole city, I think, became very proud of it, because the house just looked so elegant, sitting there in the middle of this 4-acre block.
One of the things that did spark some assistance financially for that effort was the tricentennial, the 300th anniversary of the forming of South Carolina. In Columbia, the idea was to save the Hampton-Preston House and make it the tricentennial offering of the city of Columbia. It was not being used for anything, but was really in danger of really being lost when it was acquired and stabilized. That energy and that effort certainly had a lot to do with the move towards Columbia paying attention to its history and its historic structures.
It does us a whole lot of good to just know, not just how people thought, but how people put those thoughts into the symbols that that buildings are.
So by 1972, Historic Columbia Foundation was the steward of the Robert Mills House, the Woodrow Wilson, then Boyhood Home, today Family Home, and the Hampton-Preston Mansion. During the early 1970s, Historic Columbia Foundation also supported the interest and endeavors to turn the Man Simons site into a historic property.
It was going to be torn down because it's with the Housing Authority, and an organization called the Center for the Study of Black Folklore, History, and Life got involved. Reverend Ida Quincy Newman was sort of the moving force behind that the house should not be torn down.
I started in August of 1978, and I think my title was Director of Man Simons Cottage. I was the only employee. My job was to serve as curator, to serve as developer of programs, to be the tour guide, to the extent possible, collect, develop public relations, go out, meet with people, and try to get organizations and individuals, colleges and universities around the city involved. You name it, that was my job. And so it was exciting, but of course it was overwhelming.
When Cindy Grant was hired, she and her C.C. Byers began to really work together on projects. It was also the first time that C.C. Byers was able to introduce to a large group of us the importance of Black history in Columbia. And also C.C. Byers was able to make us aware of individuals, not just groups of people, free blacks and slaves.
For all the years that African American tax money had been going toward the restoration of properties that did not reflect on our particular contribution, it seemed like the right thing to do. The personal connections that you really make with people in the houses where they had lived that really resonated with me, so that definitely excited me when I got to the cottage and there was able to think about personal connections in terms of African American people and their homes, something which you don't see very much of, or particularly at that time.
Historic Columbia Foundation went from being the curator of 3 or 4 house properties to being a leader in the museum field. And everything that includes, education, research, documentation, but reaching out in the community. In the fall of '81, beginning as curator of education, we had about 150 volunteers, and it was a very well-oiled machine.
And when I first came to Historic Columbia in 1981, there were enough docents that we had 2 docents for every house, morning and afternoon. And we only picked one house that we did our tours in. And this is a pin from Hampton Preston House.
They were wonderful to me, and it was just like a family.
And I've been with Historic Columbia since 1988.
And I became active in Historic Columbia, I think, in 1990.
I think I joined in 1996. And I used to help with the costumes.
There was a divorce, and Richland County Historic Preservation Commission took over, and then the next pin, we had another divorce, and the next pin is with Historic Columbia again. And this pin is when I was the docent president, and of course this pin is the one that I'm still using, because next year in September will be my 30 years down here at Historic Columbia giving tours.
I think I always enjoyed the Christmas tours that we did. They were such fun. We had skits and whatnot, and it was highly entertaining for us. And people seemed to enjoy it.
The Christmas candlelight tours were attracting 17,000 each Christmas to a candlelight tour, again orchestrated by the volunteers.
Historic Columbia was really a certain group of social friends. And what we did with the Landmarks Commission was to move beyond that and convince a broader world of more diverse interests that there is diversity to be explored, but also that it makes good economic sense and business sense to preserve the history of Columbia. Initially, the plan was to tear down the Palmetto building. My father was on the Landmarks Commission and was the strongest voice to save the Palmetto building, which is an iconic Italianate skyscraper, the earliest really in the city of Columbia. That and the old arcade building were 2 that were in grave danger of being torn down by developers until the Landmarks Commission got involved. And I think it's fair to say that but for the Historic Columbia effort and the Landmarks Commission, many other very important structures would have been lost.
And so there was the big push to redesign Main Street, to bring it into the 20th century, to begin to have people downtown, and it was part of the plan to rejuvenate Main Street. The big electric lights went down the center of Main Street, but Historic Columbia was often serving as a consultant to many of the concerns for people involved in preservation and in progress.
One of the areas that I've seen transformed during my lifetime has been the Congaree Vista. What a difference. A lot of energy and no small amount of money and investment on the part of so many people has resulted in this incredible district.
When I was in city council, Kirk was the one that came up with the term Congaree Vista. And so I went to his office, and it was in the old SEM bank building. And his office was in the back of the building on the top floor with this wide window, which gave you this clear view to the river in West Columbia. I said, no wonder you have so much vision. You have this view. That's why you have the vision, you have this view.
Ray Sigmund was the director at Historic Columbia Foundation from 1988 until 1998. And that was a time of great challenges for the foundation. And the process is one that ultimately resulted in Historic Columbia Foundation once again becoming the stewards of the historic house museums and being a strong force in heritage tourism.
The biggest contribution I think that those programs helped us with was realizing that we had great structures, but we had to tell different kinds of stories. And out of that came, I think, the real emphasis in our strategic plan to become more comprehensive in the stories that we told, to look at informing, using new technologies with the way we presented history and activities in our community, and to put on programs that really serve a very diverse population.
Preservation of historically important sites, neighborhoods, All of those types of preservation activities are important because it allows a community to retain a physical connection with previous generations.
The Ward 1 neighborhood was bounded by Assembly Street, the river, through the area that we know today as the Vista, and about up to Finley Park. The people who lived there and worked in the neighborhood. There were grocery stores and churches and schools. It was a vibrant community up to the 1950s, really, when the university began its expansion into that neighborhood and began to demolish those buildings as part of the urban renewal that really took hold of Columbia and most urban centers in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. I was hearing all of these stories about that neighborhood from former residents of Ward 1. My grandfather, Ed Yajin, was an artist and a professor at the university. He painted much of the buildings and the people who lived in the Ward 1 neighborhood. There was a little church on UG Street that was part of lots of his paintings, and I always loved that church.
Before they got rid of all the churches, before they got rid of Booker T. Washington, Station School, this building is more meaningful to us because it is basically the last of whatever history that we have as a displaced people.
True.
The difference in having it in 2 dimensions and having it in 3 dimensions is there's a big gap there.
It motivated me to want to really become involved, because to have someone to care enough to want to save some of the history of the images of this old neighborhood, it redeems my feelings about this city. To have them involved and wanting to do what should have been done so long ago.
We're just lucky in Columbia that we still have some of those buildings and that we still have the ability to preserve them, to illustrate them, and to make them accessible to people who want to understand the history and culture of the community that they visit or live in.
Local landmarks continue to be challenged with demolition. Historic Columbia Foundation is in the business of preservation advocacy and education, and those go hand in hand to ensure that the future will be one in which the physical character of our community reflects multiple generations of architecture, multiple generations of various neighborhoods and different people.
The efforts of Historic Columbia have really assisted the downtown tremendously in all the interactions that we've had.
Main Street's on fire, and I don't mean the 1860s kind of way, but everyone knows where Main Street is. And they make a judgment call. Does this community care about its history? Does this community care about its culture? They see a transformation taking place. In every step of the way, the foundation's been neck deep in making it a reality.
It's going to be quite an evening if we can share with you through the experiences of Warner what it was like to enjoy down under Columbia. So he's been kind enough to come back. He was here the first time and dazzled everyone, so hope you're going to dazzle us tonight.
I hadn't even had a drink yet.
Oh, impressive.
Well, we have, so that makes up for it.
I'd like to just introduce our panel, as I said. Dr. Belinda Gergel.
When I was on the board a couple of years ago, we asked the staff to identify, was it 25 or 50? 30. 30. 30 places that were, because City Council kept saying, oh, y'all always just react to everything. You come in when they get ready to tear it down. So we said, well, let's come up with a list of important structures that tell the story of the city, and we'll keep adding to that list.
Some of these sites speak to the social or political ambitions of their former owners. Others might be important for a historic event that took place there.
As the owner of the Woodrow Wilson family home and the Hampton Preston Mansion, it's the county that is responsible for annually funding operations of these properties through Historic Columbia, as well as capital improvements that these properties need from time to time.
And the county councilman pulled together and saw the value in
maintaining the only presidential home in South Carolina and appropriated a little over $1 million to restore the facility. And to have a building that was, I understand, the only home ever owned by the Woodrow Wilson family, and to have it and not preserve it and make it available to the public, I think would be something we would all regret in the long run.
Many people, when they think about the Mann Simonds Cottage, think about one building. And it was much more than one building. It was a number of thriving African-American businesses and structures that took place on the site. The excavation project has been a big success. It's revealed far more than anyone expected.
2 years ago, I had no idea this property sat on this corner, who the family were, what it meant to Columbia, just to understand and know the history of this family. The power of knowledge has shaped my mindset into different ways and new ways of thinking.
We've been able to really reach out to the community in new and exciting ways. For instance, the Connecting Communities Through History initiative, interactive websites, interpretive signage, walking tours. Over at the Majeska Simpkins House, there was a vision to establish that site as a live-work unit for a Scholar in Residence program. And it was with help from the Richland County Conservation Commission and other funding that we were able to achieve that goal.
I think one of the great accomplishments of the board and the foundation in recent years has been the beautiful garden at Siebel's house.
The gardens really give us an opportunity to be much more accessible to the public. Certainly grants us an opportunity to really make this a gift to the community. Part of the move to get outside the house museums has been to educate the community in a variety of ways. And that means developing programs like we've done with our traveling trunks. We actually take our staff and volunteers and go into the school and offer that history. Through the rehabilitation of the Woodrow Wilson family home, we've had hands-on tours and hard hat tours where people can learn how to rehab their historic windows or what kind of paints to use or how to find the history of their own house.
Working with Mr. Huss on window rehabilitation today. And this is the first in our installment of a series of workshops here at the Woodrow Wilson family home.
Tools. So what we're going to do first is remove a window.
And you'll take this right down to Fairport.
It's very rare that I see a 140-year-old good cord.
One thing that Historic Columbia is great at doing that I've seen personally is using different models and different vehicles to educate.
To me, preservation is all about that. It's all about getting outside your own interests and moving into what's good for the broader community.
Without it, we would suffer cultural amnesia, and we really wouldn't know what it was like just a few generations ago. But if they leave things behind, such as historic structures, we get to know a little bit more about what they were like.
But if they leave it here, I'm gonna be overjoyed tremendously. Because I can tell my children, I don't care where you go, what you do, hey, you started right here. This is your roots right here in this area, right here. And I can bring them back and show them. And this is one of the places that I can do that at.
It doesn't feel anymore like a handful of little old ladies, making a place where tea could be served. It feels like enriching the whole city and educating all of us.
We didn't let anybody off the hook when they said, oh, I couldn't possibly do that. And they always came around.
In those 50 years, Historic Columbia Foundation has grown with such great strides that we're now nationally recognized for many of the programs that we do.
Historic Columbia, in looking back at 50 years, has done an amazing job to change the tone of preservation in downtown Columbia. But most importantly, in the last 10 years, it's achieved more respect, and I can only encourage them to play a louder role.
We're multi-generational in what we offer. And I think looking back over the past 50 years, all of our work certainly speaks to that.
When you're dealing with the historical, that's a whole different thing, because that's for everybody's benefit. So I would say staying focused, Historic Columbia.
Columbia is our place to love, and we need to love it by preserving the evidence of where we have been and where we are and where we are going, because it gives us stability and beauty and just our own character and personality. And so the work that Historic Columbia is doing is very important for us all and for our future.